Exercise 31 deals with conduction of system of the heart and EKG. With the cardiac cycle, you have both contraction and relaxation stages of the heart chambers. So systole is heart contraction, diastole is the heart relaxation. If you take a stethoscope and you listen to the heart, you hear kind of that lub-dub, is the way it's classically described as. The first sound is vibrations of your AV, the tricuspid and bicuspid valves closing. And then the dub, that second sound, is the sound of the semilunar valves closing, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valves closing. You can listen to at different locations along the thoracic area of the heart to listen to hear the different valve sounds. So you can see depicted here, it is shown where you could place the stethoscope to hear the aortic valve versus the pulmonary valve, and then versus the tricuspid and the mitral valve. The cardiac conduction system, this refers to the intrinsic conduction system that shows how you initiate the electrical impulse that's going to trigger then the heart to contract. The electrical impulse is not triggered by the nervous system. Instead, it is triggered by pacemaker cells that are located the excuse me, I'm sorry, the sinoarterial node, the SA node, commonly referred to as your pacemaker cells. This is where there are specialized cells that will trigger the electrical impulse that then is now going to move across the right atrium, and some of it's going to pass to the left atrium. And then that electrical impulse is a little bit of a delay. It's going to come and it will now stimulate the AV node, the atrioventricular node. From there, it is going to pass down. As you can see, the yellow conduction system, the nerve passes down through the AV bundle, also known as bundle of His. This is running in that interventricular septum. That's where it's located, so it's running between the right and the left ventricles. It's going to then branch, and one of the branches continues around towards the apex of the heart. It's known as the bundle branches. It then curves back up towards the right ventricle, and the other branch is going to curve up towards the upper portion around the left ventricle. It has continued branching, is known as the Purkinje fibers. So that impulse starts at the SA node, then comes down, stimulates AV node, then the AV bundle, goes through the bundle branches, and then the Purkinje fibers. This is going to allow the atriums to contract as together at the same time as the unit, and then the ventricles will contract as a single unit. You have much more efficient pumping in this fashion. Electrocardiogram, this ECG or EKG, will be measuring the various cardiac cycles. There are different waves. You normally have initially kind of a flat line, and then you have these series of waves, these peaks. We have names for those, and they do correspond to the depolarization of the atriums, depolarization of the ventricles, the repolarization, basically the contraction and relaxation. You can also follow through and compare when the valves are opening and closing to follow the blood flow through the heart. So in one cardiac cycle, you're going to initially start by seeing the P wave. That is when you have depolarization of the atrium occurring. Then you have a PQ interval. This is the time from the beginning of the atrial being stimulated to the beginning of the ventricle being stimulated. You have what's known as the QRS complex. This is when the ventricles are experiencing depolarization right before systole occurs in the ventricles. The ST segment, that corresponds when the action potential in the ventricular cells are plateauing. The entire ventricle is now depolarized. And the T wave is ventricular repolarization that has to occur. So if you look at your standard EKG, You normally have that baseline, and then as I said, you're going to have these peaks or these waves that come through that are corresponding to you can relate to that intrinsic conduction system as that electrical impulse is flowing and passing from starting at the SA node to the AV node and then stimulating around through the bundles of His and the Purkinje fibers at the end. So here you can see the first peak is going to be the P wave, then it flows down, you have the QRS complex, then a little bit of a flat line between S and T, and then you have the T wave. And you can see how it corresponds to the depolarization and repolarization that is occurring between the atriums and then the ventricles. On this diagram, the color coordination, yellow is depolarization, the red is repolarization, and it's really nice how it shows that relative to kind of putting all the pieces together. When the SA node first sends out its impulse, and you have depolarization occurring in the atriums, that corresponds to the P wave. It's kind of putting all the pieces together. And as you follow through, the green line on the EKG is showing exactly where you are at that particular point in time relative to the picture of the depolarization versus repolarization of your chambers. So as I said, that the EKG, one cycle, they should be at regular intervals. If they are not at regular intervals between these peaks, that is indicative of arrhythmias, which is basically means you have an irregular heart rhythm. And that in turn means that there is some defect with that conduction system. Somehow you're not coordinating the contractions of the atriums and the ventricles together. Fibrillation is when you have very rapid, irregular contractions of the heart. It is not in what we call sinus rhythm, and you must do what we call defibrillate it in order to prevent essentially brain death from occurring, because the heart's not pumping efficiently. You're not pumping and moving the blood out of there. Therefore, the tissues, especially the brain, then are not receiving the correct amount of oxygen that's needed for survival. The topic focus, abnormal pacemaker. In this case, the AV node may become the pacemaker. Sometimes you see it even when the SA node is operating properly. The part of the heart becomes basically too excitable. This can happen if you have too much caffeine, excessive smoking, etc. Heart block is when you have interference with the transmission of that impulse. There's been damage typically to the AV node, and you're not able to properly transmit from the atriums to the ventricles. If it is a total heart block, no impulse is going to get through, and the ventricles are going to start beating at their own rate, which typically is too slow. Partial heart block, only some of the impulses are able to reach. Both of these are going to require artificial pacemakers to help get back into a normal rhythm so that you are supplying all the tissues with adequate oxygen supply.